All right, so in undergrad, I actually avoided tackling Dostoevsky's novels until I had the privilege of taking a Dostoevsky course taught by one of the leading Dostoevsky specialists in the whole world. She's absolutely brilliant, and thanks to her, I like Dostoevsky more than I ever thought possible. And the reason I think that it is difficult to enjoy this writer is that his works can be super convoluted, and he'll write these long paragraphs that go on and on of dialogue, and you're not really sure what's happening, and there's all these characters. And that's why I want to give other people some of the knowledge I've gained throughout my studies and my research, to help you enjoy these texts a little bit more, because what's the point of reading classics just to say you've read them? Ideally, you get something out of that experience. So if you haven't watched my previous video, I give a brief overview of Dostoevsky's life before he became a writer. That could be some useful context, but what I aim to do in this series is go through some of Dostoevsky's most pivotal works, give you a little bit of literary and historical context, and hopefully send you on your merry way to reading. So without further ado, the first novel I've chosen to talk about is actually a novella. It's a shorter work, and it's called The Double, and it was published in 1846. In Russian, it's called Dvoynik. Now, it's about a middle-aged bureaucrat named Golyadkin who wakes up one day and goes to work and finds that a man who looks exactly like him has just been hired. I believe they even have the same name, and nobody seems to notice this or find it as absurd as he does. Now I'm going to give you some of the literary context to understand this premise. Essentially, Dostoevsky was directly inspired by a work of Nikolai Gogol called The Overcoat. And if you haven't read that, it's a brilliant short story. It's a must-read in any Slavic literature course. But Gogol was known for using the absurd genre and kind of throwing in these really wacky plot twists and characters. So that's kind of what Dostoevsky's emulating here, and he's drawing on a literary trope called the Petersburg text, or the Petersburg tradition. And this, in essence, is a body of work that takes place in St. Petersburg, where the city is depicted as a place of madness, chaos, danger, just where appearances are deceiving. And this all stems from the fact that Peter the Great decided to build St. Petersburg as kind of a Europeanizing, is that even a word? As part of his Europeanization project for Russia, because Peter the Great traveled a bunch and he was really inspired by Western Europe, and he wanted his own empire to look like that. So he decided to build his own capital on top of a swamp. And there was also a very famous Great Flood, which Pushkin talks about in his poem, The Bronze Horseman. So this is a running tradition throughout Russian literature that I particularly enjoy, and that's what Dostoevsky makes use of here. Now, the genre, there's a few genres of this novella. It can fall under the fantastic, gothic, horror, satire. It's a psychological novel, which Dostoevsky was known as being the absolute king of. And in essence, that just means that he poses some philosophical questions by getting deep inside a character's psyche. Now, Dostoevsky infuses the doppelganger trope, which is a trope from German Romanticism, into his psychological novel. And the implications of that is that the doppelganger, the double in this case, is symbolic of the character himself. It's like looking at a mirror, looking at yourself. And that's the main theme of this novella. It's the horror of facing oneself. And I just find that absolutely brilliant. Now, a running motif, you could call it, is confusion. It's very confusing to figure out what is real and what isn't in this text. There's also a lot of confusion around names. At the start, the narrator differentiates between Golyadkin and his double, and then afterwards these labels become very, very slippery, and you have to kind of keep track of who's saying what and figure out for yourself whether Golyadkin's talking or his double. And as for the narrator, he has a very distinctly ironic attitude towards Golyadkin. He often refers to him as our hero, which is super sarcastic because Golyadkin is nobody's hero. He's the most pedantic, obsequious, just kind of kiss ass in essence. And nobody really notices him or cares about him. And that's why when this double takes over, you can see the effect that has on him, because he's now forced to reflect on himself, his life, his ambitions. It's really, really a brilliant story. Another element of Dostoevsky's prose that I absolutely adore would be his gestural poetics. Now, these are just physical gestures that the characters make at pivotal moments of the story. Typically, they symbolize contempt or different things at different times, but just keep your eye on interactions between Golyadkin and his double, the kind of physical interactions between them, because there's a lot to be discovered there. Now, Golyadkin's name comes from the Russian word goli, which means naked, and this obviously has a lot of symbolism, especially in the context of the double, because suddenly this character, feels completely vulnerable. It's like he has this image haunting him of himself and is really just forced to reckon with not only this kind of horrific apparition, but also his own meaningless existence. As for the reception of this novella, literary critics were not huge fans, and that's unfortunate because Dostoevsky's first novel, which he published earlier that same year, was called Poor Folk, and it did really, really well. One of Dostoevsky's idols, Vissarion Belinsky, posted a glowing review of it, and this really catapulted Dostoevsky to fame. So the kind of lackluster reception of the double was definitely discouraging for him, but obviously didn't stop him from writing. Thank God. People just felt like it was messy and chaotic. And that is true. That is absolutely true, but I think it's an incredible story nonetheless. Let me just read you kind of the first page so you get an idea of what you're about to get into. Before I read this excerpt, I realize I should mention that time and space are integral elements of this novel. For instance, the plot actually takes place over the course of 4 days only, but it is so hard to keep track of that as you're reading, especially because Golyadkin's intervals between sleep and wakefulness become increasingly unclear as the novel progresses, and you can see that right off the bat in the opening to chapter 1. It goes, "It was a little before 8 when Yakov Petrovich Golyadkin, a minor civil servant, came to, yawned, stretched, and finally opened his eyes wide after a long night's rest. For 2 minutes or so he lay motionless in bed, like a man as yet uncertain whether he's awake or still asleep, whether all at present going on about him is reality or a continuation of his disordered dreams. But in a short while, Mr. Golyadkin's senses began recording their usual everyday impressions more clearly. Everything looked back at him familiarly. The messy green walls of his little room, begrimed with soot and dust, his mahogany chest of drawers, his imitation mahogany chairs, the red painted table with a reddish oilcloth covered ottoman patterned with sickly green flowers, and lastly the clothing he had hastily discarded the night before and thrown in a heap onto the ottoman." So you can see that kind of the room around Golyadkin is kind of alive. It has an energy to it. The minute he becomes awake, he's perceiving everything around him as though in a daze, in a dream. And I just think Dostoevsky's brilliant, and you should totally go read The Devil. That's all I have to say for today, but please subscribe if you're interested in this series. I'll be posting more videos about Dostoevsky's major works, hopefully without spoilers. So yeah, thank you so much genuinely for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day.